Realistic fiction is a large category of young adult literature that focuses on real life spun every possible way. Realistic fiction is set in real world settings in time periods not far from the one that we live in. They focus on teens solving problems without magic. Topics in our everyday lives are covered. The simplest plot structure to think about in terms of realistic fiction is Somebody Wanted But So, a classic plot diagram revolving around conflict. Conflict in realistic fiction is sort of the hinge of the story that reveals the main character and their issues. Mark Aronson's an author, and he wrote that the strength of realistic fiction is that it has the potential to touch readers so deeply that in the struggle with it, they begin to see and shape themselves. That idea that it can impact us. And the images on this slide are of windows, mirrors, and doors, just to take us back to concepts we talked about earlier in the class, that good young adult literature gives you the opportunity to look through windows into other lives, unlike your own, to look in mirrors where you see your own life reflected in the characters and situations, and to look at doors that you can then walk through into other situations and realities that you haven't had any experience with before. As long as adolescence will be a time of turbulence, of learning and discovery, of pain and excitement, and a time of passionate experiencing of every single thing, contemporary fiction will be relevant and important. It is what grounds genre fiction because these experiences allow for readers to build and understand stories outside of their own experience. Contemporary fiction will never be a fad or a trend. It will always take on the topics of everyday life, opinions and debates, dealing with anything from the everyday trials and tribulations of modern life to schools, peer pressure, social media, and even politics and pandemics. In terms of its history, before 1967, teens had to borrow realistic books published for adults. But in 1967, S.E. Hinton, the author of The Outsiders, wrote an article titled Teenagers Are for Real. That was run in the New York Times Review. And after that, many young adult novels were published, including The Outsiders, The Pigman, The Contender, I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip, The House of Dies Drear, Lisa Brighton Dark, and The K. Soon those titles were followed by Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, which dealt with teen pregnancy. It didn't take long for parents and different groups to respond with concern over the controversial topics that were covered in these new young adult fiction books. This may be because parents wanted to think of their children as happy and reading happy stories, or because they saw books as a tool to teach appropriate behavior. Most authors think that teens have a better chance of attaining happiness if they understand both the good and bad aspects of the society in which they live and can develop realistic expectations. Because of that, young adult authors often write ironic or tragic stories, and there's this natural tension that exists between the parental view and desire for young adult fiction and the author's perspective of what young adult fiction should be. Censorship became a very real issue, even though the issues addressed in these novels were present in society for generations before these novels were published. The American Library Association and National Council of Teachers of English took on the challenge of censorship and began developing statements and tools to help librarians and teachers combat it. Librarians and teachers must be willing to provide materials that allow us and our patrons or students to access ideas we love and ideas we loathe, because libraries have something offensive to everyone. Common writing styles for realistic fiction are first and third person omniscient narration. First person narration is rooted in one individual's experience and can drill in pretty powerfully to one character's voice. Or sometimes with alternating perspectives, you get two characters or a whole cast of characters, and each one of them works as a first person narrator, giving you insight into their thoughts and feelings. Third person omniscient narration is also frequently used, where the narrator knows what's going on in all the characters and writes about them all from a removed perspective. One thing you have to think about whenever you have a first person narrator is this concept of the unreliable narrator. Each one of us has really unique views of the world and really unique insights into thoughts and feelings. And when you have a character who is caught up in a conflict, writing about that conflict, there's absolutely no way that that character can be objective. So their subjective perspective makes them only as reliable as their character's personal grip on reality and all the situations that are impacting the experiences they're going through. So to be a first person narrator is inherently to be an unreliable narrator. Realistic fiction can also cross over with romance or mystery elements. The thing that distinguishes realistic fiction from being a romance or a mystery is just the focus of the plot. If the focus of the plot is primarily on the romantic relationship, then you've got a romance instead of realistic fiction. If you have a story that focuses primarily on the mystery and secondarily on the character's own problems in real life, then you have a mystery and not a realistic fiction novel. But romance and mystery elements bleed over into a great many realistic fiction novels. When we talk about unique subgenres of realistic fiction, the first one that we have to take on is coming of age. So, coming of age novels deal with specific challenges that young people face. And according to Erik Erikson's Stages of Psychosocial Development, there are two main issues that teenagers face. The first is identity versus role confusion. Are they able to forge a clear sense of who they are, or are they struggling with who they are and where they fit in the universe? Now, to some degree, all teenagers struggle with role confusion because they're at a stage in their life where they are deciding who they're going to be. The difference is, are they able to forge that identity, or do they still remain confused and struggling with it? The other developmental stage is intimacy versus isolation. So, are the characters in the novel able to form intimate relationships? And this doesn't have to mean romances, though it can often mean that. Intimacy can also involve close relationships with family or friends. Are characters able to connect? Are they able to understand each other and show empathy for each other? All of those things are involved in intimacy. Versus isolation. Is the character stuck in their own world and not able to connect to others? When we talk about coming of age, we also have to deal with a concept called bibliotherapy. And this gets back to the idea of seeing yourself in other stories. This takes us into the next subgenre, which is problem novels. So, problem novels focus on prevailing social problems, dramatized through the effect on characters. So, we know what society's problems are, but how do those problems touch individual teenagers? How do they impact somebody's everyday life? That's the focus of the problem novel. They reflect what's going on in the news or different conflicts in society. They often focus on mental health and physical health issues, which can result or be connected to conflicts in society or what's going on in the news. And they increasingly focus on trauma and recovery from it. So, rape culture is a big topic that's taken on in problem novels. Addiction also falls into that category, those types of things. Bibliotherapy focuses on helping teens who are living outside the mainstream in radically non-traditional families or situations deal with their circumstances. Circumstances that often result in their being marginalized, rendered invisible, regarded as unacceptably different, or even being persecuted by their peers. Equally important in this concept of bibliotherapy is the idea of helping mainstream teens begin to comprehend intellectually and emotionally the dramatic differences that now define the daily lives of so many other teens. Everybody needs to learn empathy. They need to learn how others can become us and how we can become others. So, this idea of recognizing and accepting that there's a great variety of people in the world who have different experiences, and that we can have empathy for people who are like us and empathy for people who are very different from us. This also encompasses the concept of windows, mirrors, and doors, because good books allow us to better see ourselves and others and different ways of living so that we can enter and leave groups as we desire. So that empathy part is something that problem novels really get at. Another subgenre is relationships with family, friends, romantic partners. These relationships can be very dynamic. They can encompass a lot of different aspects of lived reality and a lot of different situations. They are not limited to a traditional romance story. In fact, in many ways, realistic fiction novels that deal with a couple are more likely to deal with their breakup or problems that they have rather than the romance aspects of their relationship. Family relationships are often cross-generational, so they might deal with a person's relationship with their parent or their grandparent or their sibling. Sometimes these novels focus on families that are blended or families that are going through divorces. All of those aspects, whatever relationships a teenager can be in, that is fodder for the subgenre that focuses on relationships. Another subgenre is adventure and survival. This can be physical or psychological. So, physically, adventure stories deal with life and death. They're fast paced and they use a lot of cliffhangers. Psychologically, they have to do with psychological survival in difficult situations like abuse or kidnapping or something like that. In these novels, the protagonist, who's just an ordinary person, is set in extraordinary circumstances. An adventure readers can either imagine happening to themselves or can believe in is critical to the story being successful. And it has to appear that it could be real. The action has to quickly draw the reader into the story. And there needs to be an interesting setting that enhances the story without getting in the way of the plot. Sports are another subgenre. They are also action-oriented. They are fast-paced. They are anchored in the sport, so specific details and strategies used in the sport are common. Aspects of that sports culture are woven in. There are memorable characters. The sport is not the main character, but it may be so prominent that it acts as a character in the story. But the characters are memorable. They're people that you want to root for. They're people that you can relate to. The characters are often goal-oriented and have a strong character arc. That means they change. They change from the beginning of the story till the end of the story in a very powerful way. So just like in a sport, you are playing to win, you are playing to achieve a certain goal or victory. The characters are often fighting for achieving a certain goal in their lives that parallels the sports story. The authors can deal with a couple of things through their writing skillfully. They can deal with teams and crowds. So they can focus in on memorable moments with teams and crowds that they either, if you think about a camera angle, they can do a panorama view or scan as a way of processing what's happening on the field of play from a variety of perspectives or angles, or they could focus in on individual viewers' angles or the coach's angle or a different player on the team's perspective of what's happening with the main character. Also, authors frequently speed up or slow down the time or action in sports stories to focus on the most important parts of a game or the most important parts of the story. So that takes a certain level of writing skill that you see in this type of subgenre. Journey or quest stories are another subgenre. They can be a journey that is physical, mental, or emotional, and it's any attempt to seek experiences, answers, love, or justice, any trip that is the focus of the story. Just because the characters are on the trip doesn't necessarily make it a journey story, but when the focus is on the trip itself and discoveries along the way, you have a journey story. It often involves a group of characters, but not always. Sometimes it's about an individual character's journey. Author Sharon Creech, who has written a lot of journey stories, writes, "I love the way that each book, any book, is its own journey. You open the book and off you go. You don't know who you're going to meet along the way, nor where you will go. And when you finish a book, you feel as if you've been on a journey. You are changed in some way, large or small, by having traveled with those characters, by having walked in their moccasins a while, by having seen what they've seen, heard what they've heard, felt what they've felt. These journeys echo all of our daily journeys, not knowing who we will meet today, tomorrow, who will affect our lives in small ways and profound ways, where we will go, what we will feel, what will happen to us." So this ties back into that concept of bibliotherapy. Because you relate to and experience the journey along with the character, that can help you navigate your personal journey in life. Humor is a subgenre of realistic fiction that has always been popular. It can be the focus of the story. An example of that would be if the character is learning to be a stand-up comedian, or it can be woven throughout the story. Sometimes humor is used to balance a very heavy novel where the character uses humor as a coping mechanism as he or she works through very real problems. Amusement is often frequently paired with fear and with death or grief, and I think that's in that balancing act. Topics of humor can cover all sorts of things. They can be just gross out sorts of humor. They could deal with schools, parents, adults in authority. They can be self-deprecating, where the character cracks jokes at his or her own expense and recognizes things about him or herself that are funny. They can deal with sex as well. Types of humor run the gamut from physical, situational satire, parody, or witticisms. Physical humor can just be a funny situation that you read about. And as you picture what's happening physically, it's amusing. Situational satire is a little more subtle. It's often about the absurdity of the situation the character is facing and what they have to deal with. Parody is when the author is kind of making fun of something by imitating it. And witticisms often show up in dialogue where characters are making ironic observations about what's going on or cracking jokes in the dialogue. Group identification in humor is a tricky thing. It can be positive or negative. It can be negative if there is mocking of stereotypes or hate speech by people outside of a group making fun of people inside of a group. Or it can be positive. It could be a way that members of a particular group affirm the unique aspects that they share in their culture or in their membership in the group, and they can bond around those shared experiences. So it can give different groups of people powerful insight into each other. It can allow you that benefit of looking in through a window or looking in through a door to a situation that your lived experience doesn't give you access to. Humor is developed from ambiguity, exaggeration, hostility, incongruity, irony, superiority, surprise or shock, a trick or twist, and/or wordplay. You could see all of that play out in that genre. Faith-based or religious novels do not make up as great a number of novels in realistic fiction as other subgenres, but they're important. As author Dean Hughes points out, we need to be careful that, in effect, we do not say to young people that they should be most concerned about pimples and clothes and dates and football games or even sex. Part of being human is addressing oneself to questions about justice, creation, morality, and the existence of divinity. What you see often in novels that have a religious theme or have faith-based characters is you can see in a bad novel, there's stereotypes. Religious characters are often portrayed as villains or hypocrites. And while that can be true about any character, including religious characters, if that is the only way they are portrayed, that's a stereotype. Representation shows characters with nuances. It shows all the different aspects to characters. So if a character is struggling with their faith, it would show them in terms of their strong religious feelings and their beliefs and the things they find comforting about their faith, as well as their doubts. And it would balance those factors in a realistic way that you can understand. That's an interesting subgenre that can focus on any faith or religious belief system. It also is one that sometimes librarians in schools shy away from because their fear of censorship. They self-censor themselves about buying those or not buying those in order to avoid offending the community and facing a censorship book challenge. So you may see more of those sorts of books in the public library than you do in a school library. The LGBTQ subgenre is one that is exploding in young adult literature in the realistic fiction genre. It deals with characters who are coming to terms with their sexual orientation and their identity. These coming of age stories have unique challenges as the characters grapple with their identities. They also may struggle with concerns about their future lives and families because they may not have role models for the families that they are envisioning themselves creating. Novels and graphic novels are taking on various topics that continue to evolve as this field evolves and as more people write about their experiences. Many graphic novels focus on memoirs of people who identify as LGBTQ. Other genres of realistic fiction include magical realism. These are books that feature a magical element woven throughout the story, but everything else about the story is realistic. So this magical element is not the focus of the story. It's just something small that's a detail that isn't fully realistic. This may be a symbol or a special skill or talent that a character can use that actually is supposed to represent something emotionally or intellectually about that character or his or her relationships. These novels are set in our world, and the characters face the problems and themes that are similar to other contemporary stories. Verse novels are most commonly blank verse, but sometimes they feature very specific poetic forms that the authors tell their story through. They're quick and easy to read. They're well suited to dealing with tragic circumstances succinctly and capturing the inner thoughts and feelings of characters well. They also frequently alternate perspectives between characters. Usually it's just two characters, but sometimes it can be a cast of whole characters. Common authors for this genre are Ellen Hopkins, E.R. Frank, Elizabeth Acevedo. Jason Reynolds has dabbled in that, as in Long Way Down. Plays or dramas are another form of realistic fiction. They are not as common. However, Monster by Walter Dean Myers is a pretty well-known example. Novellas are short books. They're somewhere around 100 pages usually. They are often spin-off stories about a popular character within a novel or a short book that covers an event in between longer books in a series. Short story collections tend to be focused around a particular topic, and they have always existed, but they're becoming more popular, focused around topics of high interest to young adult readers. Common themes in young adult literature include the end of life as it has been and transition into something new. So characters, as they're learning and growing, are learning to deal with very specific things in their lives. They often cover the idea of otherness and likeness. Who am I like? Who am I different from? Where is my tribe of people? Where do I fit into the world? Acceptance of body, self, or circumstances is another common theme. That's something that everyone struggles with in their teen years. Adjusting to change, disability, loss, mental health issues, and the accompanying emotions. Any of those things can be a topic. There's a whole chunk of young adult realistic fiction that's just focused on grief and loss. Sexual awakening and realities are increasingly being targeted in young adult realistic fiction. The idea of consent, sex, pregnancy, rape, sexual identity, all of those things are very prominent themes within young adult literature today. Poverty, substance abuse, changes to a family structure, and the way those things impact everyone are also covered in many realistic fiction novels. Bullying and violence have been themes in young adult novels since the 60s and 70s, and they continue to evolve as bullying takes on new forms with social media and technology today. Hope is a huge part of young adult literature. In some ways, young adult authors are challenged to weave hope in some way into the stories they write. The idea being that young adults need hope when they're dealing with difficult situations, and that the problem might not be solved, but they can learn to deal with it and grow as a person. When evaluating realistic fiction, here are some things to look for. The protagonist should be relatable in some way. Readers should be able to see themselves in the main character in some way. Even if the main character is very different from them, there should be something about what the main character wants, what the main character's conflict is, or their needs are that the reader should be able to relate to. The situation needs to be believable. They need to be real people in real settings. Conflicts should be realistic. Generally, one of those conflicts is internal. The character is grappling with some conflict that they're trying to personally work through. That ties in again to that concept of bibliotherapy. Well-developed secondary characters. Their friends, their romantic interests, their families should not be cardboard cutouts. They should be well-developed, fully realized individuals. The narrator should have an authentic voice. You should be able to get a sense of them as an individual speaking and sharing their thoughts and feelings. The dialogue should reflect how people really talk. So characters should have unique speech patterns. They should use slang, profanity, dialect unique to them. Diversity should be represented accurately and fairly. And the author should have a unique writing style or format or flavor, if you will. That character's work should stand apart from other books because of something that the author does very well. Criticisms that go along with realistic fiction are that sometimes authors try to make them cautionary tales. They're trying to teach a lesson Don't do this. Don't be this. Sometimes there are obvious themes that the authors hit you over the head with. There may be unrealistic aspects of the story. Some people say that infusing hope in young adult novels is unrealistic at times. However, if you think about what a challenge that is for authors, if authors are writing about a really tragic story or a story in which a character suffers a terrible trauma, devising a hopeful ending can be a real challenge from a writing standpoint. Sometimes the first person narrator's writing might not line up with that character's personal details. So if someone is really struggling as a student, but they're writing in beautiful English, it might seem like it's not a match. Family portrayals may not reflect the diversity of modern families or of the particular situations that readers could relate to. And some challenges are just too big for teens to resolve on their own, and they require outside or adult help. Young adult novels may not always present this view. Ones that do it well, though, often use adult mentors or friends or teachers, but generally they don't use parents of the characters. Some novels use animals or nature as a catalyst for getting a character through a hard time. Trends in realistic fiction include fandom. You might see fan fiction or con events or cosplay showing up in more novels. There are a lot of mixed media mashups. Those are novels that you puzzle together based on text messages, emails, or social media postings. Feminism is a powerfully evolving trend that deals with empowerment of women. Feminism can focus on strong female characters, female friendships, and it can even tackle rape culture and assumptions about men and women. Positive body representation is showcased in the diversity of body types that are presented positively in novels and in self-acceptance by characters who may not look like everyone else based on weight or other physical characteristics. Julie Murphy's books feature characters who weigh more or are significantly taller than the average young woman. Own voices is a term coined by the writer Corinne Doivus and refers to an author from a marginalized or underrepresented group writing about their own experiences from their own perspective, rather than someone from an outside perspective writing as a character from an underrepresented group. This area of YA Lit is exploding. Its boundaries are hard to measure. It's closely related to diversity and can include ethnicity, race, religion, disability, characters who are not neurotypical, sexuality, and many other diversities. Activism and politics are emerging as a prominent theme in young adult realistic fiction as more young people are becoming advocates for social change. We saw this play out in the news following the school shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Novels like All American Boys and The Hate U Give feature young people working to end police brutality in their local communities. Trauma is also being explored in more detail in novels. Rape and rape culture are being scrutinized in more novels, perhaps as a result of the Me Too movement. Graphic novels are continuing to evolve in a myriad of formats and on nearly every topic showing up in other YA formats. They're also taking on nonfiction topics. Here are the sources for this video. I hope that you have found it informative as you begin to explore realistic fiction and will enjoy diving into this genre.